we return once more to the question of Halloween. And we've touched on the needs of the holy souls in purgatory. Certainly, to this day, Halloween has, and doubtless will be, the reputation of being a haunted and strange holiday, and so on and so forth, which we'll look at a little more closely momentarily. But first and foremost, what about the things that are supposed to go bump in the night on Halloween? Or to put this another way, how does the church stand on things like ghosts? Well, if you look at St. Augustine and various of the church fathers, they would separate hauntings into two varieties. One is where you see the same scene played out over and over again. Lady Matilda walks through the blue room at midnight. And if you're there and you see Lady Matilda and you throw a book at her or something, she doesn't take any notice. She just keeps on going. For those theologians who wrote about it, this kind of haunting, where there doesn't appear to be any sort of intelligence or anything like that, is sort of a replay of an old movie. Obviously they didn't speak of old movies, but that was the idea, that there was simply no there. And for whatever reason, that scene had been impressed on that particular environment. But there are other hauntings where there appears to be an intelligence at work. And there, the medievals thought that there were three possible answers. The quote-unquote ghost could be a demon masquerading as the dead. It could be a damned soul, which, sadly, even if it's someone who's close to us in life, doesn't mean any better by us than a demon does. And lastly, a soul in purgatory, whose apparition was part of its time in purgatory, part of its atonement, and usually would appear, as with the creatures recorded in the Purgatory Museum in Rome, to ask for more prayers or masses, or to impart information to the living. So Sean Leslie's Ghost book has a very interesting example of this, where a Catholic priest had died in a hospital after taking sick. And for the next several decades, priests and laymen alike would encounter his ghost in the library of the rectory, which they found somewhat upsetting. Until 20 or 30 years later, one new pastor demanded of the apparition of the name of Almighty God to reveal why it was appearing what it wanted. The ghost pointed at a book on the shelf and vanished. The priest pulled out the book, he opened it up, and there was a list of masses that the deceased priest had taken money for, but he'd gotten sick and gone to the hospital and had not been able to say. So the priest offered each of those masses, and one for the dead pastor's soul, and the ghost was never seen again. So Catholics are not forbidden to see ghosts because they're not forbidden to see car accidents or giraffes either. But they are forbidden. We are forbidden to conjure them. So the Ouija board, all that kind of thing, seances, absolutely not. Halloween, as we Americans know it, is primarily of Scottish and Irish derivation. It came to America with the Irish and the Scots in the 19th century. One of the foods they brought over for Halloween, incidentally, was a sort of boiled potato and cabbage mix called colcannon. And it was popular because Halloween, being the Vigil of All Saints, like most vigils of major feast days, was a day of fast and abstinence. And so colcannon has no meat in it. So that's why it was a big Halloween dish. In the old country, the Irish and Scots, and some of the English, had carved jack-o'-lanterns out of turnips. That must have been very hard. I mean, I've seen many a turnip. I've eaten many a turnip in my day. Don't know Don't know how you could have done it, but they did. And the story about Jack-o'-lantern, incidentally, it was a legend they tell. The Jack-o'-lantern was a man who cheated the devil at cards. And so the devil didn't want him in hell when he died, and God wouldn't take him in heaven. So he was sent off to wander the world and delighted in misleading people in the swamps and so forth. And he was called Jack-o'-lantern. So they had the turnip to commemorate him. But then they came to the United States, and they found that quintessentially American vegetable, the pumpkin. And the pumpkin they began carving into jack-o'-lanterns. And truly, Halloween has never looked back. Not since the pumpkin was drafted to be a jack-o'-lantern. But they did a lot of other things. Apples have always been associated with Halloween because of the time of year. And so, of course, bobbing for apples was a big thing even in my childhood. Souling had gone out long, long, long before. But the custom of making mischief on Halloween became a big thing in the America of the 1880s and 90s. Big bonfires and burning all whatever trash they could get their hands on. Reassembling wagons on people's roofs or stealing their gates, breaking their windows sometimes. There was all sorts of havoc was unleashed in different places on Halloween. And it actually got worse and worse in the early 20th century and after World War I in America. Finally, they came up with the idea of substituting this sort of mayhem with trick-or-treating. Go from door to door in costume and get candy. Unconsciously, in a sense, reviving part of the old souling custom. And Halloween became a tamer and tamer holiday. It was, became much more of a kiddie thing. The fortune telling and the strange customs of the past began to subside as in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the mid-60s, the focus shifted to children going from door to door, and the spooky story and the odd shiver and all that kind of thing. And indeed, when I was a boy, that was Halloween. It was a family thing. Your parents would take you around standing in the background. Well, do I remember being excited when I turned 4 and could go trick-or-treating finally. And we got to a certain age, 12 or 13 or even 14, where you were too old to trick-or-treat. But in between, ladies and gentlemen, Halloween night was a magical night for children. And you see that sort of epitomized by the old Charlie Brown special. It's the Great Pumpkin of Charlie Brown. The magic that children invested in Halloween was second only to Christmas. It was a wonderful, wonderful, fun night. Unfortunately, already forces were in motion that would kind of mishandle it. What do I mean by that? Well, beginning in the 60s, neo-paganism began to be a force in American, European society. As with Christmas and other feasts, they took what they could from the Christian calendar and tried to re-paganize it. Nowhere were they more successful than with Halloween. So much so that a great many people today, even some Catholics, entirely disregard the holiday's Christian roots and think of it as a purely pagan or even demonic holiday. And this is reinforced by pagans and Satanists celebrating Halloween in their own particular way. There is another way that you can make souling, or trick-or-treating rather, back into souling. I've said, as we do at my house, you can put out notes asking in the candy baskets, asking for prayers for your dead. But also, if you're a parent and you have children coming home with loads and loads of candy, before you allow them to eat it, say a prayer for the dead of all the people that they've gotten the candy from. And then voila, that trick-or-treating magically, happily, joyfully turns into souling. It is indicative, though, I think, of the problems in society as a whole, that the joy of Halloween, the joy of Christmas, has been expanded to what's called holiday creep. In other words, it used to be that you didn't see Christmas decorations in stores until Thanksgiving. You didn't see Halloween decorations in stores until mid-October. Now you begin to see Halloween decorations as early as the last week in July in the stores. And Christmas decorations you often begin to see in October before Halloween has come. In some places, you'll have this weird Tim Burton-esque thing going where you've got on one side of the one row of the store Christmas stuff, the other is Halloween stuff, cheek by jowl. It's very odd looking. But while that's partly due to the desire of merchants to rake in cash, there's more to it than that, I think. Just as, although they don't really understand or know about the 12 days of Christmas, more and more people are keeping their Christmas decorations up later and later. I think the reason for it is that Halloween and Christmas, in a certain sense, do epitomize the joys of our childhood, the joys of family, of fun, which is not something to be looked down upon, in my humble opinion. And so the non-Catholic, the untutored mind, wants to extend that as long as humanly possible, which in itself, I think, is a healthy instinct. We may not always like the way it's expressed, but I think it is basically a healthy instinct that the unchurched and the unknowing want to somehow hold on to the beauties of that season. Now, I mentioned, of course, Halloween will end and will come to All Saints' Day, and thus into the month of the Holy Souls. It is also interesting to note that on November 11th, in many countries, the victors and the vanquished in World War I in particular, November the 11th is Veterans Day, Armistice Day, Remembrance Day. And in some places in America, we celebrate the nearest Monday. In Britain and the Commonwealth, they celebrate the 11th, but also the nearest Sunday is Remembrance Sunday, and so on. And depending on where you are, if you're in the English-speaking world, you wear a red poppy. If you're in the French-speaking world, you wear a blue cornflower, Bleuet de France. And in the German world, you wear a Vergesst-mich-nicht, forget-me-not. These are all part of a later cult of the dead that grew up after World War I, where so many thousands or millions of young men lost their lives in this horrible, horrible conflict. Well, although it's the feast of St. Martin of Tours, Martinmas, and is best celebrated with eating a goose and a St. Martin's Day procession, nevertheless, it too adds to the general atmosphere of remembrance of the month of the Holy Souls, of the dead. And so if you're one who wears a red poppy or a Bleuet de France or a Vergesst-mich-nicht in your lapel, it should make you all the more conscious of the need to pray for our beloved and glorious dead. But there's a lot more to November than that, as there's a lot more to October. In the new calendar, the last weekend in October, the last Sunday in October, rather, is the Feast of Christ the King. Last Sunday in November. Last Sunday in October is the Feast of Christ the King in the traditional calendar. Either way or both, as we're closing out the year, it's good to meditate on Christ the King. How loyal we've been to him through the course of the year, what we should do to be more loyal to him. Taking stock, taking account. And in the end, surrendering it all to Christ the King. That is a very, very useful note also during October and November. The other thing, too, one has to bear in mind is that as the calendar moves slowly toward the end of the year, we have other feasts, St. Clement, St. Catherine, that used to be big, big, popular feasts. November the 30th, the Feast of St. Andrew, is still the patronal feast of Scotland. And Scots around the world have dinners on St. Andrew's night. But then at last will come the first Sunday in Advent. And the new year, the new liturgical year begins. The old liturgical year, in the Latin Rite anyway, has ended. In all of this period of October and November, this period of harvest, Halloween, and the Holy Souls, it's good to remember that past, present, and future, living and dead, the church militant, the church sorrowful, and they are suffering, and the church triumphant, they're all closely intertwined.